This is Duke University.
Holly and I share a similar comfort zone because we come out of foreign language and we've moved into the sphere of medical humanities, the history of medicine. And so I'm going to focus on your point of departure, which is questions of identity. And I think that that can undergird a theory and practice of medical humanities and global health. So I'm going to begin by telling a couple of anecdotes. I was at UCLA recently, and by the way, the title Metamorphosis and Medical Humanities, or the Force and Limits of Translation, really, I think, dovetails well with all of the themes that Holly brought up. So I was at UCLA in the fall at a symposium, a small symposium called Art plus Brain equals Stories plus Structures. And this brought together neuroscientists, people in brain imaging, artists working in the life sciences, and I was sort of the resident cultural historian bridging some of the gaps between these two. And we worked in, the symposium took place in their nanotechnology center, and it was very exciting. And one of our speakers was Larry Snyder, who's a professor of anatomy and neurobiology at my university, Washington University. And he was our first speaker, and he began the day by having us all participate in a neurological test called either the Pinocchio effect or the Pinocchio illusion. How many people know what I'm talking about? Oh, good. I'm so glad. Oh, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, good. But I'm glad that a lot of people don't know. And Larry's laboratory at the med school studies how locations and spaces are represented in the cerebral cortex, how those representations are used to guide eye and hand movement. And he also obviously studies what happens when those things malfunction. So the big questions that he asks are how sensory spatial information is transformed into bodily action, bodily command. But underpinning all of this research is a larger question, and that is, how do we recognize our own bodies? Kind of the fundamental notion of self-identity of your own body. And actually, it's a much more precarious thing than one might think. So he had us engage in this Pinocchio effect. It's known as a tactile illusion, and it uses the sense of touch to trick our brain. And I'm going to show you an example of what happens. So what he had us do, all the participants had to sit sort of choo-choo train with a partner, and the person behind would reach out and touch the nose of the person in front of them as they simultaneously touched and rubbed their own nose. Okay, I'm going to show you the next slide. I think is kind of funny because the woman in front, Kathy Miller, is our chair of biology, and the person rubbing her nose is the graduate director of our art school. So I thought that was a kind of interesting fusion, right? So what happens is between 30 seconds to a minute, this bizarre psychological effect happens where the person, you're doing this eyes closed, you lose the notion of the separation between your body and the other person, and you begin to see that you feel like this person's nose out here is your own nose. And so there is this kind of mental physical fusion with another body, and you lose the sense of your self-identity through your own touch of your body. So it's actually very disorienting and very cool. At the same time, I suggest you do it at your next house party. Oh, faculty meeting. Wouldn't that be great for the larger, like, art sci faculty, have all the sciences and the humanists get together and fuse? Okay. So clearly, this is named for Pinocchio for two obvious reasons. The test is all about the nose and all about the lie. Okay, so that brings me to my teaching as an Italian professor. One of the books that I've taught for years and years and years is Pinocchio. And I teach it in an intermediate Italian classroom in the original language. And there's a lot of surprises that take place, a lot of revelations. One of the most surprising things for students is that, Pinocchio's nose growing when he lies is a rarity in the novel. It happens, I think, only 2 times, in contrast to its constant and sensational representation in the Disney film, in the TV version, and in the recent Geico commercial, right? Okay, so the other surprise for students who've only had 3 semesters of Italian is that they can understand this. They really can read and understand a novel in Italian. And this is sort of their first full-on experience of reading an extended work in the original language and something from the past, from the 1800s. So they're engaged in multiple border crossings. And it's strange, exciting, but also for students, very harrowing territory at a certain point. And those borders are, of course, language, culture, time, and space. And, as they follow this mischievous puppet across a vaguely Tuscan landscape into becoming a real boy. What is harrowing for them is actually, and I'm going to show you, here's the original text, and this is published as a serial, but it was the great bestseller of the 19th century. But what is harrowing for these students is the brutality of this coming of age story. This is not part of the Disney version. That has all been excised. So, in the original, Pinocchio is burned in an oven. He's lynched on a tree. He's robbed and beaten, including by his own creator father, Geppetto. He's turned into a donkey, and he's abandoned and left for dead. And the students are shocked and actually often outraged. And I tested this because I've got students now who are seniors who took this a few semesters ago, and I asked them on Monday, what do you remember about Pinocchio? And they're like, oh, it's such a cruel, cruel story. And and it's worse when they realize that Pinocchio is really a stand-in for 19th century Italian children, and that this is a conduct manual that's teaching sort of blind obedience to sanctioned authorities, whether they're parental or civic, and the cost for disobedience in a cruel and cold social world. Okay, so Pinocchio the test, Pinocchio the novel. What in the world does this have to do with medical humanities, or bringing the insights of literature, history, and the arts to bear on medical practice and notions of health and illness in a local or a global context? Well, in both cases, we are talking about a kind of metamorphosis. In the brain test, we experience the psychological and physical dissolution of the borders between our body and someone else's through a neurological trick. We become other than ourselves. And this alters our sense of self and also our sense of sympathy. And sympathy from the Greek roots meaning fellow feeling, an affinity between two sensate beings which experience the same influences and affect or influence one another and tend toward merger. In Pinocchio, the book, we enter the realm of the imaginary, where a piece of wood metamorphoses first into an animate puppet, and after this long disciplinary journey, into a flesh and blood little boy. The metamorphosis takes place inside the text, but also outside the text, especially for foreign language learners. The students are transformed by this experience, which extends their cultural, poetic, historical, and ethical frames of reference. It expands their imaginary repertoire, and it simultaneously transforms their notions of what is real what is present and what is native. And that is always what happens, hopefully, in a foreign language classroom. Not only do you learn about options, cultural options, language options, but you undergo a scrutiny of your own nativeness, which I think is really one of the most important things about that space of the language classroom. So artful border crossings always expose us to new cultural realities, as well as the unacknowledged qualities and contours of the place we call home. And I think that experience touches on Mignolo's notion of critical cosmopolitanism. You gain a sense of other globalizations. You know, we always think of globalization, and he theorizes a multiplicity of worlds, plurality of diversity, that is not fixed in any set of rules. He talks about the heterogeneous in-betweenness, which I think is connected to your idea of a third space. I think a lot of times what happens in a place like a language classroom is that you remain in an in-between place. I think of Wilfred Sheed's great novel, Transatlantic Blues, and I don't know if anybody is familiar with this novel, but the protagonist goes and experiences, has a full immersion in a foreign culture, and is never able to go home, which is good and bad. He's never able to be fully in the foreign culture or fully at home. He's always in this heterogeneous in-between space. And so art at its core is metamorphosis. It's the transformation, right, of bodies and souls. Andrew Felder, who's a classicist and has written a lot on Ovid's Metamorphosis, calls metamorphosis a way of dramatizing the act of representation itself. And I think a lot of what we're doing in medical humanities is focusing on representation, including global humanities. I think that's part of the reason you're showing these documentaries that are made in Africa and in the United States, is to focus on that metamorphosis that takes place in representation. So, viewing medical practice and the history and conceptions of health and illness through the lens of art, literature, philosophy, music, dance, culture, and poetics, what can it do? It can shake and remake our ideas about what we know, about what we thought we knew. It can reconfigure borders into bridges. It can test the surety of our knowledge of conventional authorities and of our very ways of making meaning. And I'm just going to show this funny this funny slide.
Oh, wow.
This was, we did a conference on Vesalius for Vesalius' 500th birthday. And my thing right now is I'm doing less of what I have to do and more of what I want to do, which is such a great place to be. But I just threw a one-act play that I kind of wrote in the middle of an academic talk, and it's showing the dissection scene from 1540 in Bologna, where Vesalius contests this notion that only the book is the authority, and he says, points to the body, and so that notion of where does authority, where does truth lie, and I think that's what happens in a humanities classroom, and these border crossings, I think. In the ideal, and it doesn't have to happen. I mean, Stanley Fish would just say, "Oh, hooey," right? But those border crossings can humble us in sort of the best sense, forcing us to acknowledge what we don't know. And actually, going back to what Holly said, which I think is critical, forcing us to acknowledge the untranslatability of certain human experiences. And I think it's important to know that there are things that we can't translate and to be humble in that. So, you had mentioned this book, The Reader, Health Humanities Reader. And I think that one thing it does offer, it doesn't have the international scope that it could, but it does it does grab onto a particular theoretical approach called the pedagogy of discomfort. And I think that pedagogy of discomfort is something that happens almost on a daily basis and in a very productive way in a foreign language classroom, where you have to examine the emotional underpinnings of your attitudes in the way you construct self and the way you construct other. And I think that can be very productive when you think about medical humanities and global health humanities. So just to return to Larry Snyder, who was the guy who did the Pinocchio illusion. So we went through this whole test and nobody knew quite what was going to happen after that. And then he came back and completed his talk. And what he said was quite surprising, but I think relevant for us. He said that as an undergraduate, he was an absolutely passionate English major. And he was really good at being an English major. He was a very good reader. He was a very good analyst of text. But then he discovered science and he abandoned English. And he really never saw the relevance of English. Once he began working in a laboratory, he has this major lab, and so his focus was data collection and empirical studies of this cortex issue with monkeys. But recently he's had this radical pivot back to English. And he's discovered that in order to do science well, and I think many of you know what I'm going to say, he had to construct his hypotheses and outcomes in story form. That narrative was essential for him to be a good scientist and to be a good teacher, and actually to feel fulfilled. And so this narrative turn really helped him produce better science, and create more coherent science and a teaching methodology that he really now models for his students, his medical students. But he also ended on with a caution, and he said the hazards to science of a good story. How many of you saw Ken Burns' recent documentary on cancer? Did anybody? Well, one of the day that was devoted to breast cancer, I thought was really interesting. We talked about this last night. The story is a very distressing story about sort of the science being all into radical surgery on women who had breast cancer, and then radical chemotherapy. So surgery gave way to radical chemotherapy, and it left lots and lots and lots of people dead in the wake of this. And the historian of medicine said, we became enamored of our stories, and we couldn't see beyond the story to look at actually what was in front of us. So Larry has found this also to be a risk, that we're enamored of that three-part story that has a nice, clean conclusion, but he said that can mislead the science and the followers of his research, most importantly, his students. So he's now trying to implement postmodern narrative techniques, which I think is really interesting. And he's trying to tell a factionalized, sometimes unreliable narrative that has no conclusion, in order to better represent the science. We brought together this semester, a lot of physicians from the medical school came, and they partnered with people in philosophy and women's studies and literature and performing arts. And what we found was this very tense cultural divide on what the point of medical humanities is and the stakes, really. And at some point, someone said, well, is this an intellectual or a social project? And if it's both, where does the emphasis lie? So I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.